one. There must be a variation within a species. And then some of you in the box wrote, has prickles, has no prickles. Variation within a species. A good 90% of you said that that variation must be heritable. You have to be able to pass it on. And 80% said something along the lines of that variation that is heritable must somehow impact fitness. A fourth acceptable answer would also include an environmental change and or selective pressure. All of those things are prerequisites for natural selection.
Is it like 1 point for each box of 6 points or 3 points?
I've started grading first hours, and all I've done so far is either write check, check plus, check minus, smiley face, because I want to see how everybody does overall before I assign points. Because if you think about it, if I do 3 points for the whole thing and you missed one of those, you're already at a 66%. And that's unnecessary. That's unnecessary. Missing one of those, I would prefer it put you somewhere near an 85 to 88% instead of a 66%, which again seems unnecessary. So those of you who are my worriers, hopefully that allays your internal panic just a bit. The next question asks you about survival of the fittest, and if you told me most people think that that means how did somebody first hour put it in a very succinct, the fastest, cleverest, smartest, strongest, and another ist in there. Not all of them, I'm sure, are supposed to be ists, but I understood the point, so whatever. That most people interpret that all of those ists, the bests, right, are what survives, and that's a misinterpretation. The next question, you should then go ahead and describe biological fitness. So if in the next question you said what it really means is that biological fitness would be that organism's ability to survive and reproduce, thus making more like itself for the next generation, then you were pretty well spot on where you needed to be. Do I expect any of you will be word for word those answers? Heavens no, only one of you word for word hit those answers from the bold words in this entire class. So, I knew there was somebody who could close their eyes and picture it. Don't panic. Those of you who did what you needed to do, don't let that be the thing that sends you into a tailspin. Those of you who did what you needed to do but didn't pay much attention or just copied answers off of a peer, well, that might tell you how much more effort you might want to put into this. And first hour should have held their end of the bargain that they did not tell you this was coming. I have a feeling who the snitch is in first hour, too. That's unfortunate. So what I would advise you guys is don't give your compatriots in 7th hour a heads up by iMessage. If you didn't get a heads up, why do they deserve one? Right? I mean, survival of the fittest and all. You didn't find that a compelling argument? I mean, I'm just saying. It's not like I was born yesterday. I know you kids sit here and iMessage each other all hour. What should you? Call what? Oh, whatever you want. evolution, natural selection, change over time. Monday.
Can you explain selective pressure? I didn't really understand it.
Sure. Because you can exchange it with 2 people. Because 20 questions is a short test. So the question was, can you explain selective pressure? Because I'm not sure I get it. Absolutely. Selective pressure is essentially the phenomenon. So it's like an occurrence that is associated with either an increase of a trait or decrease of a trait. So for example, we looked at, well, let's look at this picture. This will give you an excellent idea of what selective pressure should look like. So there are 2 moths on the screen. There are 2 there. 1, 2. If you did not see the second moth until I put a triangle around it, you are not alone. Neither does its predator. Which one do you think the birds eat more often? That one gets eaten more often. It's eaten more often because it doesn't have camouflage. So there is a selective pressure against the white moths. There is a selective pressure for the darker moths. So pressure can occur for or against a particular trait. Both of these moths are the same species. Both of these moths could mate and make eggs that would turn into other moths. The way that these moths ended up this way, and this is actually one of our pieces of evidence for evolution, they're called salt and pepper moths. And they used to look like the white one. The whole population looked like the white one, with some that were a little bit darker.
Oh, you got my message.
But something happened.
Was it the pollution with stuff resting on the trees?
The Industrial Revolution. Factories pumped out smog, pollution, soot. The trees that at one point had nice white bark, like paper birches often do, no longer had white bark. Their bark was darker. So when the white moths landed on it, they were eaten first. Who survived in that generation? The ones with the variation that made them slightly more camouflaged. Enough successive generations experienced the same selective pressure that eventually the population ended up being the vast majority of the dark moths and very few light moths. Notice that the light moths are not all dead. There were still areas far enough removed from the populated industrialized regions where being a lighter moth was still more successful. You were still able to survive and reproduce because you were able to blend in. It all depended upon that change in their environment. So there was a selective pressure with a change in environment. Does that clear up selective pressure? Excellent.
So it was kind of like when we did our experiment, like the knives and forks, there was a selective pressure against them.
Exactly. Against which ones?
The knives.
Exactly. And the pom-poms, the red or the white pom-poms specifically, because they didn't blend in anything. For those of you who are terribly concerned about the salt and pepper moth, don't worry. Post-industrial revolution, there were regulations placed upon those factories. They were forced to clean up their smog. The trees have returned back to their lovely grayish colors, and the population has, in fact, essentially evolved closer to what their original color used to be, because the trees are back to what their original color used to be. I know you all seemed really very concerned about the moths. Understand completely. Love that picture. Okay.
So selective pressure 4 is like is an organism that has any adaptation that is an advantage in their environment, like almost gives them more fitness.
Any trait any variation that allows them to better survive and thus reproduce would be an advantage, which would be a selective pressure 4. And anything that's a selective pressure against is the thing that's more likely to get you eaten. There are some instances in which camouflage is not the variation. If I were to ask you what a monarch butterfly is like, what would you tell me?
Orange and black.
Orange and black.
So pretty.
If you are orange and black,
He's not fixed.
if you are orange and black, are you afforded any great deal of camouflage?
Aren't they also extremely poisonous?
Yeah, they're super poisonous. If you ever see a bird eat a monarch butterfly, even take a nip out of its wing, you will see it vomit it back out almost immediately. It is exceptionally bitter and poisonous. Now, the way that things that are typically very, very flashy in appearance protect themselves is by being bitter tasting or poisonous. If you're going to be flashy, you better have some chemical weaponry.
Like poison dart.
Like poison dart frogs, right?
How would they have developed that?
Can I touch it?
A monarch butterfly? Yeah.
So like it won't.
Well, if you touch it, you're going to kill it, but you're not going to die. It's going to die.
Yeah, like if I
But-
feel it, it won't kill me.
No, but it'll kill.
She's not worried about the safety of her modern butterfly.
I'm just
She
wondering
just wants
because
to
I
touch it.
accidentally touch a butterfly and I.
If you go to the butterfly house at the zoo and one lands on you, just hold very still.
Okay. 'Cause I don't want to.
They're fragile, is what it is. If you touch them, it won't kill you, but it essentially renders their wings useless.
Wait, so how would they develop that poison? Like, would they have the
It
poison
could
developed?
just be that the pigment that makes them orange happens to also taste terrible.
Okay. So it's not like it was a selective pressure
It could be.
it could be.
What's interesting about it is, and when I mentioned the monarch butterfly, somebody immediately said, mimicry. There is a butterfly that did not used to look like the monarch butterfly. It was not brilliant orange. Some in its population were somewhat more orange. Others were not. The ones that were more orange were eaten less often by birds. The reason wasn't because they tasted bad. It wasn't because they excreted a toxin or a poison. It was because the birds who had eaten one of the monarchs recognized the pattern. Now, how many of you have eaten a food once, thought it was disgusting, and vowed you would never eat it again? No different than what birds do. If they eat something gross and they see the gross thing again, they're not fool enough to eat it. So the oranger butterflies from the non-monarch population were the ones who survived to reproduce with a selective pressure 4 being orange. Why? Because they ended up being perfect mimics of a monarch. Sometimes you might not be poisonous, you might not be big, you might not be tough, but if you can blend in with the organism that is, why bother being those things yourself when you can be a perfect fake?
How do you tell the difference between the two?
Because there's slight variations in size, but like just very, if I saw them, I wouldn't be able to. It would take an entomologist to be able to tell the difference. What's an entomologist? Word of the day.
Studies
Bug.
on flies.
Like a bug. So it's someone who studies bugs.
The study of entomology.
Yeah, they study bugs. That's what they do. like I said, there are disciplines of science for everybody. Maybe, you know, rocks aren't your thing, but bugs are.
So if, let's say, something changed in the environment so that the monarch butterflies were started getting eaten more often and like something caused the birds to be immune to the poison,
Uh-huh.
would they then have to adapt to another color or another?
It would render their mimicry useless, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. April sent me to get the iPad card. Do you know where that is?
Usually it's in Computer Lab B with Mr. Dickey.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Sorry.
No problem. Have you shoveled yet?
I'm doing that after school.
Oh, that's adorable. Good for you. Kind of makes me want to give you a cookie.
Is he your new assistant?
No, he's just a random kid. I mean, I know his name. It's not like he's just like some random kid I've never met before.
Wait, do you have an assistant for this class?
How did I know he shovels? Because there's a parishioner on Denwood who has been snowed in since the really big snow, and they can't get out, and they're old, and they can't shovel themselves, so they contacted the parish to see if anybody would come dig them out, and that young man volunteered to do so, and I think that's pretty darn awesome. So, and I make it my business of making sure I tell students when they do things, they're pretty darn awesome. The one thing that is evidence for Charles Darwin did not have. Poor Chuck. Most people have a rudimentary understanding of how genetics works. And by rudimentary understanding, I mean like they really have no idea. So let's see what you guys have. How do genes work?
Two types. Like the dominant is more likely to show up, and then recessive, which if a dominant is present, it will not appear.
All right, so we know that there are genes, and some genes are dominant, some genes are recessive, so dominant masks recessive. What are genes made out of? Out of what?
DNA,
What's DNA made out of?
nucleic acids, amino acids.
They're nucleic acids made out of a string of nucleotides. Those nucleotides, what are my four choices?
Adenine, guanine, thymine, and
Cytosine.
So we can just call them A, T, C, and G, right?
wait, what about yours?
RNA. So you can understand who you are and what you are. You are 3 billion A, T, C's, and G's. 3 billion of them. All in special orders. And all those A, T, C's, and G's all in a line spell your genes, the proteins that you're made out of. One thing scientists do as evidence for evolution, they compare the sequences of A, T, C's, and G's between organisms. They take very closely related species, and they look for changes. Now, everybody thinks that they're super special because you have 3 billion and you're so unique from the person sitting next to you, right? Truthfully, like 98 to 99% of your A, T, C's, and G's occur in exactly the same order. Same letters, same order. So that means only a tiny fraction is different. Itty bitty fraction. Now that should kind of confuse you because you're looking at the person next to you and you're like, I don't look like that person. So that's a really small amount to make some pretty big differences. So evolutionary biologists, that's the people who study evolution, by the way, that's their official name, evolutionary biologists. Evolutionary biologists compare DNA sequences and highlight the single change in a DNA sequence. That single change is usually the result of a mutation, and those mutations are the driving force behind evolution. It's usually a mutation that arises that produces some advantage or Worst case scenario, a mutation that arises that causes a disadvantage. And that causes a variation, which then impairs fitness or helps fitness.
So that's like, but if this is like this baby change, this very tiny change, how come we're all like drastically different?
I was just
Twin
gonna ask,
6'5", not 5.
how many
Well,
times-
something like height is what we actually call multifactorial. So you have at least 15 genes that control your height.
Just for the It seems like, wait, genes is in like a string of DNA,
Uh-huh.
which has all the little different matchups?
Mhm.
Oh, okay,
So there's 15 of them, and in multifactorial traits, it's not just your DNA, it's your environment.
So this doesn't really have to do with DNA.
So your height doesn't necessarily have to know.
Okay.
Very, very simple traits like your ability to roll your tongue. That's genetic. That's one single gene. A simple single change in your bases causes your ability to roll your tongue or not roll your tongue. There's no option in between. There's no feeding you something different. It's really that simple. One change. One tiny change, like one change in one letter of those 3 billion letters, causes cancer. So one change in the wrong spot is hugely different.
So, say I went in and like, I'm not trying to like, I kind of like changed one of the ATCGs in an experimental rat. Could I possibly give it cancer? So if I-
Yes, we do that all the time intentionally to figure out the particular sequences or regions in DNA that would cause cancer. But we do that in animal models, not humans.
It's not like you can just look at a microscope and see it.
Most of the time, like things like skin cancer are caused by UV radiation, right? Radiation causes a change in a single base pair.
No, but like, how do they know, like, the strands, or not like strands, but like the chains and stuff? Like, how do they figure out what the order of?
So there is this really fascinating area of science called genomics. And genomics, its goal is to figure out where every single gene is located in every organism. And they figure out where in the locations and on what chromosome, and they do it in a variety of weird ways. Essentially, they put DNA in a chemical blender, and then they measure the lengths of the different parts, and then they take all of the parts that they've measured and then piece them all back together like a puzzle. Woo, pray!
Let's quiet ourselves.